Thank you all for being here. I'm very excited for this session and this speaker who I've seen speak, I want to say twice, for sure once, but I want to say twice, very compelling. Jacob Mchangama is the founder and executive director of the Future of Free Speech. He is a research professor at Vanderbilt University and a senior fellow at the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, or FIRE. Hope you all like my socks. In 2018, he was a visiting scholar at Columbia's Global Freedom of Expression Center. He has commented extensively on free speech and human rights in outlets including The Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal, The Economist, Foreign Affairs, and Foreign Policy. Jacob has published in academic and peer-reviewed journals, including Human Rights Quarterly, Policy Review, and Amnesty International Strategic Studies. He is the producer and narrator of the podcast Clear and Present Danger, A History of Free Speech, and the critically acclaimed book Free Speech, A History from Socrates to Social Media, ambitious project to say the least, published by Basic Books in 2022, and he's the recipient of numerous awards for his work on free speech and human rights. Please join me in welcoming Jacob Mchangama. So I want to start with an observation and a quote from probably a mutual acquaintance of ours, Greg Lukianoff, about there are a lot of things in Western civilization that we take for granted that are actually weird historically, and I think free speech is one of them. You've written powerfully during your career about the importance of free speech, but also you're a scholar of the history of free speech, which I think is a really interesting angle that you have. So in the long and global view of history, free speech is the exception, not the norm. Greg Lukianoff calls it the eternally radical idea for that reason. So let me ask you, what makes free speech such a radical idea and such a rare practice? And can you give us a sense for how radical and how rare it is in the long view of history?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. It's an honor to be here. Delighted. It's my first time in Colorado as well. Wish I had more time to explore this beautiful state. Yeah, you know, imagine living in a society where the ruler is seen to be divine, not only to rule by divine right, but to be divine. And then imagine living in a society where the people are the ones who make the decisions. That's sort of how radically different a system based on free speech and one that isn't. And for most of human history, we've lived in societies where authority, political authority, religious authority has been more or less unquestioned. So if you were in ancient Egypt, your pharaoh might be seen as a divine person. That's not someone who you question. And therefore, there's no questioning about how society is structured. Or if you do so, at peril, and you might very well risk very draconian consequences. And so that's why it's so radical what happens in ancient Athens with the Athenian democracy, where suddenly you have this idea of a radically, by their standards, egalitarian conception of free speech. All freeborn male citizens have a direct voice in affairs. And you have a culture of free speech called parrhesia, meaning fearless speech, where everyone in the agora, in the marketplace, has a right to speak, and also speak irreverently, speak what we might today call truth to power, speculate about the big ideas. You could have Plato. Plato is certainly no friend of democracy. He's not a fan of democracy, but he has the right and the ability to set up shop and philosophize. Aristotle is not an Athenian citizen, so he can't participate directly in politics in the ecclesia, but he can, again, set up shop, philosophize, criticize the Athenian democracy for what he sees as its excesses, and that is just radically different from most other societies. And the downstream effects of that are immense, right? Who are the big Greek rivals of Athens? Was Sparta, right? How many great Spartan philosophers do you know? Like, what's the huge Spartan contribution to Western philosophy or literature or science. I mean, there probably, maybe there are one or two, but it's not a virtue that was nurtured or valued by the Spartans, who are a much more militaristic, hierarchical society that valued, strength, martial values, and not the intellectual curiosity that characterized Athens. And as I said, the downstream effects of that are pretty huge. Think about, well, of course, I mean, Greek culture would inform the Romans, but it also becomes a game changer for in medieval Islam, for instance. What makes the Abbasid Caliphate a powerhouse, intellectual powerhouse before Western Christendom really ticks up? Well, it's the fact that they translate almost all secular Greek ideas into Arabic and diffuse it, and they have like the first early radical free thinkers. So in that sense, I think free speech really is a game changer, a civilizational game changer. And what is always sort of involved in free speech is that it essentially allows everyone to challenge and question authority, right? No longer do you operate under a system where the king is the one who has the last words and can just make any decision, or where you have a caste of priests who gets to decide, what is capital T truth. You no longer have unquestionable orthodoxies that can be imposed top down. So in that sense, it is an equalizer, but it's not a dumbing down of society. It doesn't equalize by dumbing down. It becomes sort of a race to the top, if you like.
So you've touched on what I would say are three societal virtues that people consider downstream from free speech. One of them is freedom. We probably don't need to discuss why free speech makes you freer. Let's talk about the other two. So the second one is equality. Can you give some examples in history of how free speech has been used instrumentally to increase political or some other type of equality?
Yeah, and again, ancient Athens is a perfect example of that. It was unheard of to have the unwashed mob, the unlearned lower classes have a direct voice in political affairs, that you could question everything. You could even poke fun of the gods. That was radically different and a very egalitarian conception. So if you go to Thucydides and you read Pericles' famous funeral oration, you will see that he extols the virtues, what makes the Athenians special, right? And of course, it's a rose-tinted portrait of the Athenians, who certainly had their faults and were not virtuous in everything that they did. But he basically says, we Athenians, everyone has a share in power, and also, we discuss things before we take action. We are also not afraid of letting foreigners come into our city, have open discussions. That's sort of the operating system of Athens, is openness and egalitarianism. And that was also an attempt to constrain sort of the oligarchic factions that for a long time tried to subdue, sometimes succeeded in subduing the Athenian democracy. And it was, of course, very, very stark contrast to Sparta. So Demosthenes, who was a famous orator, said that in Athens, you can praise the Spartan constitution and criticize the Athenian one. But if you go to Sparta, you can only praise the Spartan one and criticize the Athenian one. And that, I think, today is still sort of the litmus test of free speech, right? Are you able to criticize the political system, the authority, the institutions that you live under in your own society or not?
So if you'll indulge some presentism for a second.
Yeah.
Would you agree with the following two claims? And if so, why? And if not, why not? The first is that free expression has been pivotal and instrumental to the successes that we've seen in women's rights, civil rights, and LGBT rights movements in the United States. And the second claim would be that countries and regions within countries that have more free expression on average tend to have much better protections for the rights of women and minorities.
Yeah, I like to say that free speech might be the most powerful engine of human equality that our species has ever stumbled upon. I think no one in America has said it more eloquently than Frederick Douglass, who said that the right of speech is a very precious one, especially to the oppressed. And he is someone who embodied both the practice and the principle of free speech. He was, the impact that he had. William Lloyd Garrison wrote when one of the first time that he saw Douglass speak in Nantucket in 1841, and later on he'd write something along the lines of, he'd describe sort of the wonder of the impact that Douglass had, and he said something along the lines of, I think I never hated slavery as much as in that very moment. So that you can just almost feel the impact that Douglass had on a crowd. But at the same time, Douglass praises the principle underlying the First Amendment. He praises the principle drafted by men and who could have owned him. Madison, the architect of the First Amendment, was a slave owner. Jefferson, another proponent, they would sit in the sweltering Virginia heat. They would be fanned by slaves, and they would write these great principles. But Douglass understands that these principles, when taken seriously, are not hypocritical. They're universal, and they're deeply empowering. And that lesson will be taken up by the civil rights movement. John Lewis famously said that without the First Amendment, the civil rights movement would have been a bird, like a bird without wings. And something which is often forgotten in these times when a lot of people argue that free speech is being weaponized against minorities, that it's an excuse for white supremacy. It's a very popular argument these days, is that a lot of the core First Amendment victories before the courts, before the Supreme Court, were won by the civil rights movement, including by Thurgood Marshall, the very first African American Supreme Court justice.
So that's great. So let's move to the third downstream societal benefit of free speech, the oven here, and that's prosperity or progress. You mentioned earlier about how Sparta isn't on the map the same way that Athens is regarding its intellectual legacy. The economist Timur Kuran has written about how parts of the modern day Middle East have suffered in terms of their prosperity from repression of speech and other rights. So can you comment on that? What is it about free speech that has facilitated throughout history some of the prosperity and gains in what you might call material measures of progress? Like what's the cause and effect line?
Yeah, so free speech. So if you're a European and living right after the printing press, right, you might say this is one of the worst ideas we ever had, right? Because all authority has been thrown up into the wind. Religious wars are fanned. Millions of people die. No one can agree on anything. People are being persecuted, and European Christendom is just in a mess. But from our vantage point, it's one of the most consequential developments in our history, and the benefits that we enjoy from those are immense, right? And so you see that very clearly, that in the countries that adopt the printing press most aggressively, you also see a spike in literacy, in book consumption, and maybe the best case is the Dutch Republic, like a very small corner of Europe that rebelled against the Spanish Habsburgs and became the wealthiest country in Europe, the freest country in Europe, and it also became the printing house of Europe. So essentially, because of its decentralized nature, this is where you'd go. If you wanted something that was a bit racy, that was too blasphemous, question authority, you would smuggle your manuscript into the Dutch Republic. You'd have a Dutch printer print it, and you'd smuggle it across. It was a bit like, you know, the dark web or a VPN in the way that we think about it today. But it was also there's a clear parallel between that and the wealth of the Dutch Republic. You also see it's an interesting statistic that in the French cities where you had the highest degree of subscription to the encyclopedia, they had a much higher degree of invention. So that talks to the effects of the diffusion of knowledge and new ideas that again depend on free speech, right? And you can compare the trajectory of Europe with the Ottoman Empire, right? So in the Ottoman Empire, you have to go into the late 18th century before the printing press is allowed to operate, and it takes a very long time before it's allowed to publish things in Arabic or religious texts. Now, if at the time it might have seemed smart by the Ottoman Empire to say, hey, we don't want that because look at what's going on with those stupid Christians. They're tearing themselves to shred, while we have, you know, we have unity in religion and so on. But the consequences of not adopting print technology is probably a contributing factor to the different trajectories of the Ottomans and Western Europe when it comes to science and so on.
Great. So we've steel-manned the case for free speech, right? The freedom, equality, prosperity. Those are the stakes. Okay, if you're trying to decide whether or not to defend free speech. Thank you. Now let's return to the present and steel-man some of the modern cases against free speech. So I'm going to list 3 arguments and get your reaction to them. Okay, so first, free speech allows hate speech to spread, perhaps especially in the social media age. For example, and this resonates with my experience on X, the X algorithm frequently promotes videos and memes with racist undertones, if not overtones. The TikTok algorithm sometimes promotes praise for Al-Qaeda as one example, and lots of CCP propaganda. Therefore, we need to censor social media at the very least, if not punish, as they do in some European countries these days, people who post or share these harmful things. We should be especially censorious of speech that threatens racial and sexual minorities and women and other groups lacking power in broader society. What's your response to that?
I have a lot, but let me take a step back. And, you know, so you could say, you know, all of us here in the room are weird, right? You know, we have specific ideas that are not necessarily universally shared around the world. So there are still many people in the world who have values that put a premium on religious tradition, not just religion as a private virtue, but as something that should permeate society. Of kinship, of personal rather than impersonal rules. And if that's your kind of society, if that's what you value, then free speech is not a great idea to adopt it, because free speech tends to erode those types of societies. And so if you look at the World Values Survey, you'll see countries, this is a simplification, but you'll see Protestant Western European countries adopting values that are sort of very individualistic, self-expression, not emphasizing authority and religion, and you will see Muslim majority countries in the opposite corner. And of course, to a lot of people, the values that most of us here, I think, share are not necessarily the most important ones. They are not necessarily the ones that provide you a meaningful life. In fact, in many ways, free speech might make you read things that collapses your worldview, right? If you've had very strong beliefs about certain truths, and you read them, and suddenly you no longer just feel that it's right and true. And if you allow people to question those things, then societies may deviate from those values. Another more general objection, modern objection, could be China. China can say, no country in the history of the world has done what we've done. We have lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in record time, and we're now rivaling the United States in our ability to create and disseminate technology. And we've only been able to do that because we have centralized control in a Chinese Communist Party. If we had, had democracy, if, the students in June in 1989 had won, then China would have never reached the heights that we've gotten. Everything would have sort of decayed, and there would have been disorder. You can agree or disagree with that proposition, but that's a counterpoint you could make. Then, when it comes within sort of Western democracies, the arguments that you're making about hate speech are typically made by people who will say free speech is important, but it has to be balanced against other supposedly competing interests, and free speech should not, as civil libertarians like myself would say, be the most important fundamental freedom in a democracy. And so, they will argue, for instance, as you rightly said, hate speech creates harm. If you're a minority, you're in the digital age, you're likely to be confronted with hateful speech at scale that might make you feel unsafe, that allows racists to troll and do coordinated campaigns of hatred against people. Disinformation is, of course, one of the big topics of our time. The flip side of everyone being able to...
We're going to get there, so okay. hold that.
Yeah. Well, so when it comes to hate speech, I think there are a number of compelling arguments. One of them we've already touched upon. The fact that free speech, in my view at least, has been a net benefit for minorities, whether it's the enslaved, whether it's Jim Crow, whether it's the right of women. Because typically, if you're a minority, if you're a persecuted minority, you don't have political power. You don't have guns. You don't have the strength to violently overthrow the system that is persecuting you. So how do you ensure that you get the equality that you deserve? Well, you take up the case. You try to persuade your fellow citizens. You shine a light on the injustices that you're facing in the style of Frederick Douglass and many others before him. And when you have a society, when you have a country like the United States, which is based on a promise of universal freedom and equality as being values that go hand in hand and should not be mutually exclusive, well, then you have something very compelling when it comes to exposing that type of hypocrisy. Then there are other reasons why you should be skeptical of adopting hate speech. If you're a minority and you argue for speech restrictions, who's going to adopt those speech restrictions? Who are the ones who will be enforcing them? Well, that will be whoever is in power. That tends to be the majority. And so you are really relying on the majority to, quote unquote, protect you rather than use their powers against you. And that is, of course, something that we've seen be abused again and again. So I think you're safer relying on a very principled approach to free speech that protects everyone, even the Nazis that want to march down Skokie, even if you're a Holocaust survivor.
Great. So let's go to the second objection, or my characterization of it. We need to have intelligent public conversations on vital yet complex issues like climate change, vaccines, and public health. Social media is full of mis and disinformation that is making it harder for us to have these conversations. So social media companies should do their best to censor or soft block this mis and disinformation, and the government should encourage this as the Biden administration did. What's your response?
No, it's certainly true that there's mis and disinformation, though I tend to think that, and this is something that has actually been studied by a lot of people, that the share of mis and disinformation, and how you define that is a whole different question, is smaller than the headlines in the media would suggest. The number of people who are likely to believe and share it is also smaller, but they might have an outsized impact on social media platforms because there tend to be hyper-partisans who are the most engaged on social media platforms. But most people do not, log on to X, read something something that is completely absurd, and then magically adopt that belief. It's actually quite difficult to change people's political views and perceptions. And of course, there's the ever dangerous question of saying who gets to determine the capital T truth, right? We most of you may remember that at one point the lab leak theory, the idea that COVID originated in a lab in Wuhan, was deemed to be sort of a racist conspiracy theory that was removed by various social media companies. Then new information came out that made it more plausible. At least I have no idea about the origin, but that I think is a very good illustration of the dangers of just saying, hey, this is the truth, and you need to police that at scale, impacting the ecosystem of information of hundreds of millions of people. I also happen to believe that I think it's quite valuable for society as such to be able to see what different people believe or say that they believe. I think that gives you a better opportunity to counter some of the things, the ideas that you think are harmful or wrong. And I just think it gives you a more realistic snapshot of the world that you live in, rather than trying to impose top-down control of the ecosystem. But and this is something, it's a recurrent phenomenon. Which goes back to ancient times. It's two conceptions of free speech that we see being in conflict. One of them being sort of an egalitarian conception of free speech, is a bottom-up approach to free speech. Everyone has a voice. The other is a more elitist conception, which says that yes, free speech is important, but we need to have institutional gatekeepers. They're the ones who get to exercise free speech on behalf of the masses to filter information in a responsible way. And outbreaks of elite panic have been frequent throughout human history. We see that every time new communications technology is developed, when previously marginalized groups have a voice in public affairs. If you go back and read newspapers, when you were discussing whether women should have the right to vote, you will see a lot of arguments made by people saying, of the disastrous consequences to society of allowing women to vote, to have a direct vote in politics. And I think we have to be wary of that elite panic.
Great. Okay, so here's a third common objection to free speech. Children are vulnerable and impressionable. We can't have books, programs, or curricula in K-12 schools and college that teach kids to hate each other on the basis of race, to hate America and the West on the basis of false and or distorted information about history, or to be confused about their sex and gender in ways that might alienate them from their families, or worse, rush them into life-altering, sterilizing surgery and hormone regimens. What's your response?
Yeah, so I'm generally... I'm a Danish citizen. I moved to the U.S. 2.5 years ago, living in Tennessee. As you can imagine, Tennessee is culturally slightly different from Copenhagen, Denmark. Even though I prefer the First Amendment and the U.S. Approach to free speech, one of the first shocks I got was when I got a message from my son's high school about the books that they were removing from the library after parent groups had objected. And these were like, where the crawdads sing, books that have been made into movies and so on. Nothing, that would ever occur to me as being something inappropriate for high school kids. So, obviously every library, every school library has to curate, make decisions about what kind of books they want on their shelves, which ones are the most conducive to the mission. But I think that the Save the Children argument is one that has been abused, and it's one that has been abused for a very long time. I recently saw a play, it's called An Alabama Story. It takes place in 1959 in Montgomery, Alabama, where the public library has a book, I forget what the title, but it's basically a book where a black rabbit and a white rabbit decide to get married. And you can imagine in 1959 in Montgomery, Alabama, that was seen as not so subtle propaganda for integration and interracial marriage. And so there was huge pressure on the librarian to remove that book. And I think that, again, is a common thread throughout history. I mean, Socrates, right? What was one of the charges? Corrupting the youth, right? That's one of the reasons why he was executed. So it's hardly a new phenomena, and that's why I tend to be very, very skeptical of that argument.
Let me ask one follow-up question, and I'll resist asking you a follow-up question about Socrates' history with youth. For those of you who are familiar with it. But it was not what he did in real life. It was his ideas. Yeah. I'm going to resist to go there. Okay, your response. My characterization of your response to my question is basically that this problem, as I paraphrased it, is overblown. And I think in many cases, including the ones you mentioned, that's a point well taken. But it doesn't address the argument of what if it were true? Would free speech kind of still win the day? And let me just give you 3 examples where I think it's less obviously overblown than in the case of where the crawdads sing. So a good friend of mine who lives in Toronto and has mixed race children told me once that he knows his daughter's learning something crazy about white people when she starts going to school in super traditional dresses from her mom's culture, and that she learned that white Europeans killed all the large mammals in North America. He said you should read about the Pleistocene. And another example, in terms of books, there's a book, somebody in the audience can correct me if this is wrong. There's a book that's been targeted by some of these campaigns called Genderqueer that has very graphic depictions of oral sex in it that some parents have objected to, at certain age groups. So what would be your response to examples like that? Or even not necessarily those specific examples, take as premise that my characterization of what's being taught is true. Does the free speech argument still win, in your view?
So I think there's a difference between for instance, if you have a library that has all kinds of literature, and that the kids, and I guess it also depends on what age, right? You'd expect a elementary school library to be quite different from a high school library, to be different from a middle school library in how it's curated and the material available. And so, as I said, I accept that there has to be some kind of curation, and I would accept that in a school environment, having graphic, pornographic magazines that's not really the why kids are in school. But I would not necessarily say that they should not be acquainted with books that might have a historical narrative about colonialism, imperialism that I personally don't subscribe to, because those are ideas that are out there. I would say it's different if that point is being hammered home, and that's the only thing that they learn, right? But I would be in favor of them being able to have a lot of different perspectives, even perspectives that I vehemently disagree with. And again, then where do you draw the limit, right? If you read Aristotle's Politics, you'll find a lot of things in that book or in that work that you would that we would see, basically advocates for gender apartheid, right? Is that something? Do we need to go and blot out those passages? It basically says that certain people are born to be slaves. Should we blot out those parts of Aristotle? I think most people would say no, that's not a good idea. So again, with schools and children, it's a specific setting, and again, I would agree that there has to be curation, but given the sort of moral panics and the collateral damage to learning more generally, I would tend to err on the side of permissiveness.
Great. Okay, let me ask you a follow-up of one of my earlier questions. Since I pushed you from the right, let me push you a little bit from the left. When we're talking about public health, many in the health profession would argue that in the case of, for example, the COVID-19 vaccines, the stakes of some of what they would characterize as misinformation was tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of human lives. Does that consideration affect your response to the free speech question or not? So let's accept that. It's probably I don't know how reliable the claim is, but let's accept for a moment the premise that that hundreds of thousands of people died because of COVID mis or disinformation. Then, and I think this is a logical fallacy that we often see in free speech debates, then it becomes much more tempting to argue for, well, then we need to censor certain types of speech. But it does not follow that because certain types of information might be harmful, that it is an effective remedy to censor it, or that the cure of censorship won't be worse than the disease, right? Is it likely that in the United States, what would be an effective remedy? How would you effectively limit the circulation of COVID mis and disinformation in the United States, where you had committed communities of people who were very skeptical of the vaccine and had delved into, shall we say, esoteric theories about COVID? Like you might be able to shut them off social media platforms, but there are myriad ways in our digital world that you can communicate, right? You could create listservs where you send out emails. You could communicate by encrypted messages and so on. You could have meetups. You could go back to print technology. You could record things, audio recordings, and spread it. What would be like the remedy that you were willing to use to effectively shut down those types of dissent? And also, again, like what type of mis and disinformation at a time, where we're faced with a virus that no one really understands, that we're trying to fight in real time, and where we constantly update our knowledge about it, and where we have certain assumptions about it that we may see as flawed 2 weeks later, just because we're hard at work at trying to understand it. So that's why I would be
cautious about that. I think a good example is that is somewhat related to it is a guy, I think his name was Luis Muniz. He was a Portuguese eminent psychiatrist and physician. And in 1949, he was given the Nobel Prize in Medicine. And what was his great contribution to medicine? Well, he pioneered what we today call lobotomy. And I mean, this was a guy who was not evil. He was not looking to subject the mentally ill to horrible treatments. He was at the cutting edge of his profession at the time. He developed measures that he believed, and a lot of people were convinced, would ease the suffering of people that you just didn't know how to handle and who were subjected to horrific conditions very often. But with the advance of further science, you find out that maybe lobotomy was not a great way to handle mental illness, and then you start at have different medicine and different treatments. So even a Nobel Prize winner in medicine can obviously be wrong, and that's why we need open science, right? We need to question. It's not like, hey, you get the Nobel Prize in medicine, and now no one can question your landmark achievements in medicine. No, you may actually have gotten the Nobel Prize because you were brilliant at the time, but you operated in an environment of limited knowledge, and other people have now tested what you've done and found out that you were actually mistaken, or maybe you were right in some points, but the unintended consequences of your discovery were just a cure worse than disease.
What's the best argument against free speech that we haven't covered yet, if there is one, and what's your response to it?
Yeah, so I'd go back to sort of the relativism point, right? If you're a human being who really value traditional values, hierarchy, then free speech is not going to be conducive to the life that you want to live, to the society that you want to live in, because nothing is really sacred, right? Anyone has the right to poke fun or question your core beliefs. And so I can understand someone like that, if that's the kind of society you want to live in, why you would not want free speech. And then, China and other sort of authoritarian societies who have sort of learned to say, yes, we will adopt a market economy, we'll adopt modern technology, but we don't want democracy and free speech because it breeds instability. We don't want that. And if you're China or if you're Singapore, maybe that's a compelling argument to you because you've seen, you've lived under crushing poverty, and the system that doesn't incorporate free speech has delivered for you. A more pragmatic argument is, I'm someone who's very much against hate speech laws, such as exist in all European democracies. But you could have sort of a pragmatic argument saying, listen, Western Europe was completely destroyed by totalitarianism. A genocide, industrial scale genocide took place. And therefore, we need to have certain restrictions on free speech. Those restrictions may be sometimes cause collateral damage, but if you go to France, if you go to Germany, if you go to the UK, they might restrict and punish speech that you don't hear in the United States, but they're still functioning democracies, right? Power changes hands peacefully. You have a vibrant media. You have opposition parties, opposition politicians. So, what's the problem? Why should we want a First Amendment? And I think that's a pretty good argument. I think better arguments against that position, but I think it's a pretty reasonable argument for a more limited conception of free speech that deviates from the American one.
So an economist might respond to your, if I happen to know one, might respond to your China example and even your Europe examples and say, well, regardless of what works or doesn't within a country, the marketplace for global talent is just that, global. And net migration flows, perhaps especially of high human capital, clearly point to a revealed preference for more expressive freedom. And the countries that benefit from those net migration flows, including us, until a couple months ago, maybe, are benefiting from that. Would you agree with that, or am I being too much of an economist?
No, I think that's absolutely right. I think it's a huge competitive advantage for the United States, one which is unfortunately being undermined at the moment. Imagine being a brilliant scholar in some country where you don't have free speech, and then you get to a U.S. university, and suddenly you're allowed to question everything. At least in theory, that is something that I imagine attracts a lot of people. I come from a country where I had a lot of free speech, but still the American conception of free speech was so appealing to me that I was willing to move with my family to the United States. So I think that is compelling. That is one of the many benefits of free speech, of academic freedom.
Suppose you're, say, the daughter of Xi Jinping, who attended Harvard. What's the difference, in your view, if there is one, between free speech and academic freedom?
I think academic freedom is sort of a subset of the larger freedom of expression. And I think the values that Heterodox Academy works for are super important. But it's also, if I am walking down the streets of Nashville, I should be free to say whatever I want at any time. If I'm a biology professor here at CSU, I really hope that you don't consider it, because that would be the end of the biology program of this university. I'm not at liberty to suddenly start saying, hey, today I want to teach you about freedom of expression, right? My mission is to teach that. And so you could say that is a limit on free speech, if you like, which I think is understood as part of academic freedom, which I think few people would have any argument with. You could also say there are certain norms in a classroom that don't apply at a raucous debate, that we take turns, or you might be, as a student, you might be punished if your answer is wrong, right? You don't have, you can't be, the First Amendment, even if you're a public university, doesn't protect you from getting bad grades if you do a bad job on your exam. You can't come and say, hey, I have free speech. I can just write whatever I want in my exam on a given topic. So in that sense, there are meaningful differences between the broader free speech and academic freedom.
Do you ever think, as a follow-up question, do you ever think that line can get blurry in some cases, right? So suppose that everybody in a certain field decides prematurely, from the perspective of the evidence, that a certain line of inquiry or a certain answer is off limits, right? For example, suppose that any research that casts doubt on the severity of a particular impact of climate change is taboo, and the response to somebody saying you're violating my academic freedom is, well, everybody knows that that's a ridiculous finding, so you should be censored. What's your response to that, and how do we find where the line is?
Yeah, no. Obviously, you should be able to question everything at a university, and there's also a huge difference. Like if you're a professor, and you quote unquote punish a student by giving them a bad grade because they do poorly on an exam, that's one thing. But if you punish that student with a low grade because you don't like their political viewpoints, or because you don't, if they said something which is relevant to the course, but you disagree with it, let's say it's a political science or class on law, and you don't agree what they come down on abortion or whatever, then that obviously is not compatible with academic freedom. So and maybe sometimes those lines can be blurred in the setting of academic freedom, because we understand that there are some restrictions that don't apply when it's me walking down the streets of Nashville, or me writing an op-ed or a blog where I can write whatever I want on whatever topic.
Suppose, take as premise that you have a field that's drawn that line too far in violation of academic freedom. How do you correct that without opening the door to kind of genuinely unscholarly crap from getting in too?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it's sort of the history of academic freedom is one of constantly fighting against various orthodoxies, right? So in the early 30th century, there was this panic, especially at the University of Paris, about the corrupting influence of Aristotle, right? You can't teach Aristotle, we'll ban Aristotle. And what happened was that other universities then in other parts of Europe said, hey, do you want some of that sweet Aristotle? Well, come here, so it became a competitive advantage for other universities to say, hey, yeah, you can come here and study. So that's one thing, sort of having pluralism and having a broad ecosystem of educational institutions that hopefully don't all have the same orthodoxies. But then, orthodoxies can change. So in the 14th century, William of Ockham's teachings were suppressed. And why were they suppressed? Well, because they went against Aristotle and Averroes, who had been sort of a prominent translator of Aristotle. So, this is one of the things, I guess, which is maybe difficult in a higher ed setting, that you come to believe certain things to be absolutely true. So whether that's on racial justice or climate change and so on, and that then creates its own orthodoxy, something that was seen as radical and groundbreaking at one point becomes the new orthodoxy. And how do you ensure that you allow for the curiosity and freedom to challenge those orthodoxies, even when it seems at the time to be completely bonkers and something which is maybe unscientific?
So you're saying that market competition is the mutualistic cousin of free speech, which is totally speaking my language. One last question before we go to audience Q&A. The podcaster Konstantin Kizin ends his podcast with a similar question that I like. So in this context, what's an issue related to free speech that we're not talking about, but we should be? We just had a panel about AI, and everyone talks about AI, but I don't know that we talk about free speech and AI enough, and the consequences of the choices we will be making about regulating AI. I like to think of a sort of two. This is an overgeneralization, but sort of creative AI versus intrusive AI, right? Creative AI is what empowers curiosity, gives us access to learning at an unprecedented scale. One of the most enriching things that I've done with GPT is just to use it as a tutor when I read the Odyssey or the Iliad or Aristotle, and it's an incredibly high level, and you can just go down rabbit holes, so that's incredibly enriching for a person like me who's not trained in that particular discipline. Of course, there are all kinds of other empowering things, but it can also be very intrusive. So, for instance, I'm a green card holder, so I was a bit worried when Marco Rubio went out and said, hey, all foreigners who are entering the US, we're going to use AI to scan your social media accounts, and anyone who says anything that we don't like, especially related to Israel, Palestine, which is something that it's not sort of a topic that I delve into, but who knows where the red lines are drawn,
are likely to be punished for that. And of course, China is like the most aggressive example of a country that uses AI both to automate censorship at scale, but also to have to really filter the ecosystem of information and ideas in ways that we thought unimaginable when Bill Clinton in, I think, 1999 said that, you know, Chinese attempts at censoring the internet was like nailing Jello to a wall, and they've become quite good at that. Just to round that up, I think there are sort of two ways to look at how to think about regulating AI. One is what I would call user empowerment. So that basically is the idea that AI is a neutral technology. It's neither good nor bad. It can be used for a lot of good things. It can be used for bad things, the way that the printing press could be used to create pamphlets that could help incite pogroms against Jews in Eastern Europe, and it can be used to facilitate learning and so on. AI will be the same. And so what we should do is that we should restrict the abuse of that in the sphere of ideas. If you use AI to create threats or incitement to violence and so on. The other competing model is one that I call preemptive safetyism. So this is the idea that AI is such a powerful technology and the harms are so great that we need to have some kind of authority that filters models and ensures that they don't generate harms. It's essentially sort of the 3.0 of pre-publication censorship, the way that we try to control harms of the printing press, right? And I think because AI is now embedded in all the ways that we interact with the ecosystem of information and ideas, if preemptive safetyism becomes a model that prevails, that has huge, huge implications for intellectual freedom, for free speech, and access to information, and maybe even freedom of thought. Right now, the user interface that we have with AI is typically text or audio, right? But you know, in 20 years, it might be sort of brain-computer interface that you interact with AI. So imagine that and sort of a deeply censored or filtered model. That's sort of the wet dream of every authoritarian, that you could essentially have a form of mind control of all people. That might seem like a dystopian right now, but changes are happening at a rapid pace.
Very interesting, and I'll just close by saying, as a fellow green card holder who has disagreed with the administration's policy on Canada, I'll just say that I somewhat shared your concern about surveillance, but then I was comforted by the fact that the foreign policy of the administration is that I should get a passport. So maybe they should just give me one. On that note, I'll open it up to audience Q&A, and thanks again, Jacob Mchangama, for a really interesting and insightful talk.
Looking for hands. Right behind you. Yep.
Heidi, I was wondering if you think there are any, when you look across history and around the world, do there seem to be any social or cultural prerequisites that need to be in place for the introduction of full free speech to be on net a good thing? Or is it ever the case that it would be better if some sort of if these prerequisites were allowed to develop first before free speech or full free speech became, it would be better that it would developed after some sort of prerequisites were met instead of just being airdropped in before the culture was somehow ready for it. Is that something that you see looking over?
Yeah, I think that's a really history. I think that's a really good question, because we tend to take free speech for granted in the US, in Western Europe, but the truth is it was a very long, drawn-out process. It's a process that hasn't really stopped. Like, free speech is never, ever fully won or lost. It's always contested, but we've made huge strides. But that was not always the case, and there's been many setbacks, right? Sometimes, if you were living in, say, 1789, you might think well, free speech is now, at least sort of in the West, is this principle that has finally been enshrined in various documents. It's even being embraced by rulers. Then you have the French Revolution, and everything goes to hell in a handbasket. And then there's a huge clampdown all over the world, all over Europe. You even see repercussions here in the United States with the Sedition Act of that, and then suddenly the mood changes and free speech is set back decades and decades. All that to say that in the countries that enjoy it, they have had a very long period of experimenting with it, and we actually have some data which suggests heavily that in democracies, free speech is associated with less violence, less terrorism, but that is not as robust when it comes to more authoritarian states. And I can't give you a convincing explanation of it, but it could certainly be true that in certain countries, if you just open up immediately, well, then it might lead to instability. But I can't say, well, if you have this specific in place, whether it's culturally or economically and so on, then free speech will necessarily thrive. What we can say is that there's never been a successful democracy without free speech.
So maybe to state my question slightly better, maybe, or for those of us who consider free speech to be a very high priority that we want to foster to the fullest extent possible, are the things that in our own culture, prerequisites that we therefore really should take a strong interest in cultivating, so that our goal of free speech is not has a good effect.
Yeah, I think there are. So one historical trend that I call Milton's curse. So John Milton is the famous English poet and writer who wrote the Areopagitica in 1644, this famous defense of press freedom and criticism of pre-publication censorship. But when you read it more closely, you find out that John Milton is not in favor of press freedom for Catholics. He's in favor of blasphemy laws, and he ends up being a censor under Cromwell. So and we see that, unfortunately, with a lot of heroes of free speech, Voltaire and many others, John Adams, to mention just a few. And so this is Milton's curse, this very human tendency to be in favor of free speech, but being able to convince ourselves that for specific ideas that just by chance happen to be ideas that we vehemently disagree with, that they are so dangerous that they should be suppressed. So we can do a lot in terms of being cognizant of our tribal nature, our tendency to fall prey to Milton's curse, keep that in check. I also tend to think that free speech advocates have done a poor job of showing more concrete ways that free speech benefit people. So most people are not hardcore civil libertarians, right? Even in the United States, where civil libertarianism is pretty strong, and there, when society is in a flux, when new technology comes along, when you live in an age of uncertainty, a lot of people are going to view free speech in certain manifestations as a threat. And if all you then can come up with is John Stuart Mill or James Madison, however eloquent they are, you're not likely to be able to persuade people who are reasonable, who have some commitment to free speech, but are concerned about some of the dark side. So I think one of the things that we've done at the Future of Free Speech, for instance, is to create this toolkit on counter speech. So it's based on research. What are effective ways that you can online counter hate speech? So it's a way of empowering human rights activists, students, journalists, and others to say, you're concerned about the way free speech is being used by some to spread hatred. Here is a way that you can use free speech and access to information to counter that. It gives you agency, it empowers you to do something about it. So those kind of things, practical tools rather than mere abstract principles, however important they are, I think is critically important.
John Tomasi from Heterodox Academy. I guess we all are. Hi, Jacob.
Hi, John.
I want to follow up on the question that was just asked, which I think is such a lovely question. I want to put it into the college context and put a little twist on it. So the question was something like, what do we think about free speech norms or principles being dropped down into a culture where it hasn't been practiced or people don't understand why it's valuable? And now thinking about that same question in terms of being dropped down into a college campus inhabited by 18, 19, 20, 21-year-olds, many of them, tricksters still from their teenages. And here's a little twist about that. One of the really striking things about university life is that students and student groups are ordinarily empowered to invite speakers of their choice to campus. Faculty are empowered too, but it's interesting that students are empowered to do that. But in my understanding, very few student groups are given much guidance about what kinds of norms or practices or cultural preconditions they should attend to when they make decisions about which speakers or speaker groupings they might bring to campus. I wonder if you have any thoughts about that, and maybe some work you've done at Vanderbilt will throw some light on this, but there's this interesting thing that some of my colleagues and I at HXA talk about sometimes, and that's that there's this interesting empowerment we do on campuses, including the empowerment of student groups to invite speakers, which sometimes blow up and all kinds of stuff happens. Do you have any thoughts about what kind of cultural condition, what kind of cultural education, I'm going to use the word, those kind of might be appropriate for student groups given that power?
Yeah, I think it's important for universities. A lot of universities I've noticed are creating these programs to foster viewpoint diversity, academic freedom. They're sprouting up all over the place. But what I think is crucially important is that universities don't just do that because that's now the fad and because they sense there's been a vibe shift in the culture, that universities are suddenly your targets, and a lot of people have seen them as failing their mission, but that they actually live up to it, right? So it's not enough to create a program. You actually have to live that program. And that means empowering the students, saying, we will have your back if you invite a speaker that is controversial, that is where you face backlash from other students or from faculty and so on. I think that that is important rather than where you just sort of say, yeah, we're committed to viewpoint diversity and academic freedom. We invite a wide range of speakers, but then when students invite someone, then they sort of say, oh, well, have you thought about the consequences of that for the feeling of safety and community and belonging at the university? So I think that's one step. Really, like if you're committed to academic freedom as a university, I hope most are, then it has to be more than sort of an edifice that you put on to check a box. It has to be something that is a living value. And that I get that is difficult.
I, again, need to play the bad guy and intervene. Would you join me in thanking Jacob and Matt for a fantastic discussion? Thank you both.